I need to understand like this obsession with turkey.
We need him and Matt.
I just don't get it.
Just stay away. Just say no. Don't do it.
And we're back.
Hey.
HUNTR Podcast, episode 63, as Colton keeps me in line.
Yeah. Thank you, Colton.
February 24th, according to my calendar.
Yeah, man. Round the corner here.
Yeah, February's almost out. March is here. Shed season, food plots.
I'm going to stick with my optimism and say it's the fastest February that I've ever experienced.
I just went over I had a little travel binge there over the last 2 weeks, and well, you were with me for one of them, and yeah, so I'm ready to be home. I'm ready for some just enough weather. Well, you went shed hunting.
Yep.
You found a forkhorn.
I ran around for a bit. Yeah, there was still a lot of snow. I went out to the farm that I killed my buck on this year, hoping to find there's 2 big 3-year-olds on it.
We think we've seen them on camera.
Yep. So I got my corn pile out probably a week too late because the first time what looks like a good buck showed up, he was already shed.
Shed out.
He's either on that property or on the next one over. But there was still a lot of snow, even though I gridded it really well. I mean, there's still a chance that antler's laying out there. So
yeah. So I mean, weather looks kind of warm, wet. It's going to clear that snow out here pretty quick. I think next week will be pretty good for
maybe gone now.
For around
it's
here.
Been warm.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know what it was just doing outside. So,
what was it doing? I'm curious.
It's not freezing rain, but it sure as hell isn't too far from it.
Just thinking about it.
We got a little ice coming this way, but yeah.
Happy February.
Yeah, no doubt, man. Anyways, last week on the podcast, we kind of did a shorter podcast, but it really was a tee up for this week. We got into some of these agency discussions, and it was cool to hear some of the feedback from guys. Still a few guys that aren't quite getting what we're trying to put out there, which is we are not anti-crossbow hunters. It's just we're trying to lay out all of the data and all of the numbers so that everybody can make their own decisions and see where trends are. And one of our buddies, Jordan, commented to, I think it was Facebook, he sent it, and I posted it on our Instagram and Facebook. It was a snapshot of Wisconsin over the course of the last 7 years, 8 years, something like that, maybe even more, 10.
Harvest data by the weapon.
Yep, by the weapon. And it had vertical bow separate from crossbow. And the interesting thing is you saw a dramatic decrease in vertical bow harvest and a significant increase in compound or crossbow harvest.
So I think this would be our chance to clear it up. I think on that Instagram post, the top of that top graph you couldn't see. Couldn't see the title of it.
Yeah, it was vertical bow.
Okay. So there you go. Anybody that's wondering.
Yep, vertical bow on the top. It did say bow on the side there, but gotcha. You're right. Vertical bow on the top, crossbow on the bottom. And you could see that it's only been relatively new. I think it was 6 years ago that they enacted the legalization of it. And I mean, it's just been a constant, increase on that side. And then, and it's not just like somebody could say, well, yeah, but what are the scales on the numbers? No, they are now harvesting more antlered bucks via crossbow than they are vertical bow in the state of Wisconsin.
Not to put you on the spot with it. Do you know, are they harvesting more deer, period?
No, it's decreased.
So less deer harvested, but more of those are with a crossbow.
Including somebody made a comment on it, the number of antlerless deer that have been shot is dramatically decreased. That, I assume, is a state agency change. So they probably changed allocations or bag limits or something. I don't know. Haven't done enough research into that, mainly because that isn't the focus of today's podcast. But I want to continue down that path because I think Darren shared some interesting stuff from Minnesota that there were some good numbers on. A lot of people threw Michigan under the bus, and Chad, who I know fairly well. So maybe we circle back at Chad at some point on that. But it's again, and it's not to pinpoint these agencies. It's just that everybody's different, and everybody doesn't necessarily come forward with these numbers as much. And I think it's something that not everybody cares about. We do, and we're interested in understanding what these numbers are, and then the thoughts of the agency as they set these landscape level harvest criteria.
Well, yeah, dude. And contrary to, I think, some of our viewers' opinion or observation, like, we're not trying to prove anything. Like, we're certainly not out against or to say anything against any of our fellow hunters.
No.
You know what I mean? We've said it, but I mean, we'll just keep pounding it in the ground here. It's like, dude, we're fully in favor of any hunter who's acting within their legal right to
100%
to harvest an animal, regardless of their weapon of choice.
Yeah. We may give you a hard time about it, but like we're not going to say you shouldn't do it.
Right. Right. And expect that as for brotherly love, right? But that said, I do think that both you and I have experienced some unpleasurable things that we see as being tied to the way that those seasons are treated. And so
yes,
that is the nuance in this conversation, is it's not directed or even between a wheel bow hunter, a vertical bow hunter, or a recurve hunter, or a crossbow hunter, or even a gun hunter.
Exactly.
Those restrictions and regulations are passed down to us by the agencies that oversee our states. And so our guest today, I think, is somebody who has more knowledge. The most knowledge on how those numbers are looked at, how these season dates are executed, and may be able to answer some of our questions regarding how that's done.
Yeah, so we've got Pennsylvania Game Commission Executive Director Bryan Burhans on the podcast today. And kind of just to piggyback off of that before we tie Bryan in, there is one question that I'm trying to get to, and I don't know if there's just a clear black and white answer to it, but it is it's essentially when are too many hunters too many, basically. And it's something that, frankly, nobody can say that they've talked about in the last 10 to 15 years, because all we've heard about in the last 10 to 15 years is the 3 R's, which is recruitment, retention, and reactivation. And it's just recruit, retain, reactivate. And it's just the push. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's recent numbers, and this doesn't even include COVID, we have been on the increase. So basically, have we been trying to stuff 10 pounds of potatoes in a 5-pound sack?
Are there too many hunters?
I don't know. Yeah, and I don't know. And who makes that decision to say there are, and then what happens when we hit that point?
Yeah. I think personally, my hope is that by the end of this podcast, we may not like the answers, but I think a lot of our questions will be answered. We should have an understanding of how the state of Pennsylvania looks at hunter numbers and decides to use those in the allocation of tags and of season dates. And so whether we like it or not, hopefully we've got some answers on those, and we can understand how that's happening.
Perfect. I'm bringing Bryan. Here we go. Hey, we got you, Bryan.
Hey, I'm right here.
All right, man. We I know not everybody got to hear our kind of talk at the beginning of the podcast, but you definitely have the best looking background that we've had on the HUNTR Podcast. This is your episode number 63. So Jared and I kind of set out to do one of these a week starting in January. Yeah, right around the first week of January in 2021. And we've been able to stick to it since then. So
which is true. If you get to know Jeremy and I, is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
We're pretty proud of that.
My wife will say that's the longest I've stuck to anything in my life. So that's just how it
stuck
goes.
to or lasted.
Either on that.
I see what you did there.
So yeah, there you go. Well, listen, Bryan. First of all, and again, appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us on the podcast. It's one of those things that we kind of talked about in the pre-discussion that, for as long as I know, I'm 37. I've been hunting in Pennsylvania since I was 12. I was around in the early 2000s when, Dr. Gary Alt went, city to city and talked about, what was probably the most significant change in Pennsylvania deer hunting history. And I remember, being as part of a very diverse family that, some were in favor of it, many were opposed to it. And a lot of those same people today sit there and say, I can't believe how many big bucks that we're seeing, in the state of Pennsylvania as that goes on. But I think that there's still kind of I call it a weird stigma in that the Pennsylvania Game Commission in a lot of hunters' minds in this state still is, I guess, call it unfavorable. And it's one of the things that Jared and I have talked about in even some recent podcasts to say, I know in my past experience, I've been around other state agencies, and in certain states, like I know that the deer biologist for that state agency is kind of one of the guys. You see him at the hunt clubs and stuff, especially in the South, a lot. And we don't necessarily see that here in Pennsylvania. And so, I guess one of my first kind of discussion points is, what do you think about some of the perception around the Game Commission, especially in, let's say, even the last, 10 years or so?
Well, let's look at the perception first, because if you look at, we all run with crowds of people, whether it's family or friends or whatnot, and we hear what we hear. And this is something that's, in wildlife management or anything else, what you hear and what you see isn't necessarily representative of the entire population. We've done actual surveys through a company that surveyed hunters and asked them of their perception of Pennsylvania Game Commission. It actually comes out very, very high. Some of the highest numbers than any other state agency. Pennsylvania actually ranks very, very high as far as what the attitudes, perception. So recognizing that, in certain areas, or groups that you may interact with may have a poor opinion of the agency. Overall, the agency does very well as far as trust, and they look to us for, wildlife management and scientific information. I think one of the things you got to remember, though, in Pennsylvania, we have the second highest hunter numbers in the country. So we've got a lot of hunters. So the more hunters you have, there's always going to be hunters that are unhappy with the agency, no matter what we do. If we gave out $50 bills, there's going to be a group of hunters that aren't going to be happy with us for one reason or another. Maybe it was cash instead of check. I don't know. And if you look culturally too, Pennsylvania is similar to states like Michigan, Wisconsin, in that the culture around kind of always pointing their fingers at the agency is something that's kind of been handed down generation to generation. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I'm a Pennsylvania native, and we didn't see any deer, and it must be the Game Commission's fault. But we're a big state. We're a very diverse state, and there's varying opinions. I've worked and lived in, a bunch of other states in the Southeast, and, your hunter populations are much lower compared to Pennsylvania. So the number of people with different varying attitudes is going to be different as well. But one of the things that's different about Pennsylvania, because we do have the second highest license sales in the country, we have a finite limited resource, and the agency has to put a lot of work into making sure that we sustainably harvest hunting or the wildlife populations that we allow hunting. So, we have much more confusing, if you will, or tight regs on a lot of our species. You go to the Southeast, it's very liberal, as far as your seasons and your bags. I lived in South Carolina. I think you can shoot somewhere around 10 deer, and Mississippi is the same way. It's much more liberal. In Pennsylvania, it's much more traditional with much shorter seasons and more of a finite time that hunters can participate in the field. So, from our research and companies that have looked at us compared to other state wildlife agencies, Pennsylvania does really, really good. There's a lot we need to do, though, as an agency. One of the things that we started about 4 years ago is we actually put together a whole entire bureau called Marketing and Strategic Communications to better communicate to the hunters, to do a better job of telling our story, of telling the why behind regulation change or the why behind season structures and seasons and bags. So those are areas that we recognized, and trying to do a much better job of explaining to the public and being accountable to the public of the things we do and why we do those things.
Yeah. And Matt, is Matt Morrett the division chief on that side?
He's the bureau director.
Bureau director. So, and we had Matt, if anybody's listening to this, you can go back probably, I don't know, little less than a year now. We had Matt Morrett here in studio on the podcast, and it was a great
We'll post
guest.
it in the description so people can jump back.
I think, Bryan, you made, and I didn't think we'd rabbit hole down this fast, but you made a really good comment that, I don't know, I've been very vocal about, at least in the last few months, is the fact that the wildlife populations are a finite resource. And it's something that I don't know, even as, my background as a wildlife biologist, I haven't really acknowledged as much in terms of from a state level or even from a national level until recently, and it's personal experience. Jared and I have gone and hunted a bunch of different places. We've hunted public land, whether it's COVID or whatever you want to point to. Pennsylvania, I've been born and raised during opening days in Orange Armies, right? But the number of hunters I've seen throughout the season in certain places has been extraordinary. Something that I don't know if I've ever seen in my lifetime. And again, maybe a lot of that's attributed to COVID, but my concern grew not just because of the finite resource of, let's say, from a deer population, as much as even the hunting experience. Like if you're a public land hunter and you're in 1,000-acre state game lands, for instance, how many people can you put into that 1,000 acres, somewhat unregulated, right? Because we don't do draw systems and stuff like that. Right. Before the experience, it deters that person from continuing to be a hunter. And I know that that's not necessarily a loaded question, but it's, is that stuff that you guys have discussed internally on that end?
Well, I think it's been more of a national discussion. If you look at, there's a recent article that was published on another podcast, as part of another media group, talking about R3, retention, recruitment, reactivation. And, the issues around, well, do we really want more hunters out there? Because they're just competing against us for a limited, finite resource. And it's an interesting discussion to have, because as hunters, what do we want? We don't want competition. We want abundant game. We want to be successful. Those are the things we want as hunters. But the other reality of it is hunting, if numbers continue to dwindle, at what point does it even socially become not relevant anymore? And in addition to that, just in my own personal opinion, is I want to share the hunting experience with others, because it's been such an important part of my life. And I know you two sitting on this today, it's an important part of your life. So hunting is just an amazing thing that we all cherish and we all love. But it's an interesting conversation. So you look at the state lands of Pennsylvania. One, we got to recognize, because I've lived in a lot of other southeastern states, don't have much public land. We have almost 6 million acres of public land here in Pennsylvania. We are truly lucky. When I lived in other states, I had to write a check for a lease. That was the only way I was going to hunt in those states, because there just wasn't an availability of places to hunt, at least public hunting areas. Here in Pennsylvania, we look at North Carolina, for example. So they have game lands as well, and some of their game lands are only open, for example, turkey hunting a couple days a week. Wow. In Pennsylvania, we don't have those restrictions. Now, we have a lot of public land, and a lot of land culturally is still open to hunting by permission. So we're lucky in that respect here in Pennsylvania, that we still have that culture where people have access to lands. And then, of course, there is leased lands in Pennsylvania as well. But as far as, packing hunters onto the game lands, it depends what you're hunting. If you're hunting deer, you're probably benefiting from that, in that you got to move these deer around. From being deer hunters, if you're in the general rifle deer season, those deer will sit there till you're 50 yards away, 100 yards away. They won't get up and move at all. The deer are they're used to people, so they're just going to hang out. And at the same time, a lot of our game lands and state forest lands, Allegheny National Forest, is large enough that if you're willing to put the effort and get back in there, you're probably not going to see another hunter. Now, the other flip side to that whole challenge is, if you look at most of the lands that state of Pennsylvania acquired, or even Allegheny National Forest, it's not your prime farmland. So the habitats are more rugged. And when you have more rugged habitats, less fertility in the soil, your ability to hold as many animals is going to be much different, say, in Center County or in Elk County than it is in Lancaster County or, Southwest Pennsylvania, Washington County, just because there's more food availability, higher productivity of the soils. So it's really hard to really compare apples and oranges when you're talking public versus private. Now, I'm a big turkey hunter. I love turkey hunter. And the last thing I want is competition from another turkey hunter. For the simple reason is I don't want them boogering up my turkeys. And so, but I've learned myself is, well, I'm willing to hike back 4 or 5 miles and get away from those people. And I've also learned to be patient. The birds are still there, and they may be sore-lipped because they've interacted with some hunters. But I just got to ramp up my calling a little bit, and I got to be a little softer in my calling and more strategic. And that's all part of hunting.
Yeah. So I guess when we look at some of these national reports and stuff, places like Georgia, areas of the South that, let's say in the early 2000s, maybe weren't even the top 15 for licensed hunters, are now creeping into that top 10, top 5 segment. Overall, from a Pennsylvania aspect, and feel free to chime in from even the last couple years with the COVID impact. Are we still seeing a decline in license numbers from, let's say, the 90s?
No, well, actually, we were seeing a decline since about 1982, and every state nationwide was seeing that decline coming in. It averaged somewhere around 2%, 3%. When you look at the years prior to 2019 here in Pennsylvania, the 3 years prior to that, we lost between 28 and 25,000 hunters a year. We're dropping out every single year. And then in 2019, prior to the pandemic, the commissioners made some regulatory changes. They extended the bear season. They went to the Saturday opener. We had Sunday hunting opportunities. And all of a sudden, did we not only not lose 25 to 28,000 hunters, we actually gained 5,000. So we almost had a 30,000 hunter swing in 2019. Then you go to the next year with the pandemic, with COVID-19, and we saw an additional bump. This year, we're still seeing good numbers, not as high as the pandemic year, but still on par and higher than 2019. So, licensed sales, at least for Pennsylvania, have turned around in the last 3 years now, have been very strong for us. Now, if we were to maintain that level, I think most people would be pretty excited about that, because it's still in excess of over 850 licenses out there in Pennsylvania. We're still a hunting rich state, and a state with a rich culture of hunting. That's phenomenal when you look at some of the southern states where you're talking about 250, 280,000 hunters, just far fewer hunters out there. And for some of those areas, it's tougher to find a place to hunt, but there is availability for hunting out there. So in Pennsylvania, we have a very, compared to other states, we have such a more rich hunting culture, a traditional culture in Pennsylvania than any other state. I remember one time when I was living in South Carolina, I went out opening day of rifle deer season. And I got out there extra early, I'm going to beat the crowds. And I get out and I drive down the U.S. Forest Service road, and there was no cars parked there. I actually had to call my wife at 5 o'clock in the morning. I said, "Can you go through the digest to make sure that the hunting season's starting today?" And she said, yes, it's open. So, I couldn't even see another car, because we have such an opening day phenomenon in Pennsylvania, where in the southern states, your season's so long and it's so liberal, you really don't even have that opening day effect down in many of those states.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and we were talking to some guys the other day. The one thing that, I was born and raised on in this state was, the tradition of deer camp, right after Thanksgiving, going to deer camp, being with, a roster of 10 to 20 guys in camp, hunting opening day on Monday, Tuesday, and then usually coming back home. And, it seemed like that kind of faded off, but there is a generation that seems like they're trying to bring that back, and I know for a lot of places, you mentioned like Elk County and stuff, those small towns and stuff thrived off of that type of business coming up during the bear seasons and the deer seasons and stuff. And then, you kind of saw that fall by the wayside there for a while, and it seems like it's coming back. And, it's probably because that generation is now having kids, and they're wanting to get those kids to have the same experiences that we had. And so I think that's always been kind of a rich piece of the Pennsylvania hunting tradition, though there's obviously so much more that the state has to offer. That time was something that, even if you only hunted a couple days a year, you tried to make it part of that deer camp tradition, I guess.
And you'll see, one thing when you look at the culture of hunting in Pennsylvania, one of the things we have to recognize is we've had generational changes. So, for example, my dad and people that are my grandfather's age, how they looked at hunting and how they participate in hunting is much different than my generation or your generation. So, for example, it was very typical for, during deer season, dad was going to take his week. That was his vacation. He was going to go hunt, and that's all he's going to do. Younger generations, my generation and your generation, are less likely inclined to do that. They're going to save that time off, what time they do have, to go do something with the family, go to Disney World or go something like that. That's why you've seen with this Saturday opener change, when we did our surveys, one of the things we found that is some of the hunters that really liked the Saturday opener tended to be hunters that were under 55 years of age and had kids and liked to hunt with their kids. And that was a big change, because they want to be able to go out there and spend time in the forest with their kids out there hunting. So you're seeing a generational change. The other change you're seeing in Pennsylvania as well is we're very much a bow hunting state. Whether you're using a vertical bow or a crossbow, the number of bow hunters continues to climb in Pennsylvania. It's very strong in Pennsylvania. We have a long season. Let's face it, the weather's a whole lot better than freezing to death in rifle deer season. So it's maintained a very strong following in that rifle deer season. And now with the extension of the archery season deeper into the rut, it's giving individuals more opportunity, and throwing a Sunday opportunity in there. It's been fantastic.
And
real quick, Bryan, in terms of guys taking like that week off, and you said we're not seeing that as much, is that just in the state of Pennsylvania?
I know. I think it's a national change. And, when I grew up, it was very typical. That was what the guys did. They got together, went to deer camp. And there's still guys that do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as I look at my generation and younger generations, they're just not inclined to take limited vacation time and maybe go to deer camp when there's family activities that they want to participate in as well. I talk to hunters all the time, and it's one of the key things I find. That's why the Saturday opener Sunday was so popular with many of the hunters. Was like, I work during the week. All I got's that weekend. So they're not even taking that week off to go hunting. That's what they have available to them, but with limited time off, especially for younger hunters who may not have the vacation time build up, or if you're working in a construction or other type of field where you don't have the seniority that you can even get off. So it's really challenging people's lives to find time to hunt. I mean, let's look at the COVID numbers. COVID numbers really adds a lot of evidence, some evidence to suggest that people having the ability and time to hunt is the biggest limiting factor to hunting. And all our surveys say the same thing. When we ask our hunters, what is the single thing that keeps you from hunting? It's time.
Or the fear of their life and not be able to have meat to eat.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would just take that year off the table probably.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting. I mean,
I will say also that we haven't seen that. I mean, maybe that is the case, but we've seen a huge influx of people, going out of state to hunt, to all the states that and that's why I ask if it's on a state by state basis, is because we're also leaving. We're going to Kansas, we're trying to go to Iowa, we're going to the Dakotas, we're going to Illinois.
But remember, you're not the majority of hunters.
That's true.
Sure, 100%.
Yeah. Not even close.
Well, but I will say in those states, it seems like the number and like the likelihood to draw is getting much, much harder. Because people are taking
it is.
that
Absolutely.
time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've seen a strong resurgence of hunting in the last couple of years. Hopefully that continues. People with COVID, got an interest in getting out there and hunting, and hopefully they stick at it.
Why is that, Bryan? Why in terms of like that being a strong year, you're saying, hey, we're doing really good on numbers. Is there like a goal? I guess let's stick with Pennsylvania. Say, hey, per the resources that we have here, the lands we have access to, the wildlife that we perceive, this is a good number from year to year. This is how many licenses we want to sell. Does that number exist?
No, I mean, it's fairly arbitrary. Our strategic plan goals has been to at least stabilize. In other words, not continue to lose hunters. If you look at the data and you look at the decline since 1982 and you draw a line down through all that, at what point does it get too close to zero? Hunting's never going to go to zero, but nonetheless is how many fewer hunters. Let's face it, for us in Pennsylvania, especially white-tailed deer, we rely on hunters to keep our deer numbers in check. And at what point in time do you lose enough deer hunters to help? We have struggle as it is to keep deer numbers in check. In fact, you look over the last 5-7 years, our deer numbers have increased in Pennsylvania. They haven't declined. It just depends on the wildlife management area you're in. But we rely on our hunters to help keep those deer numbers in check, because they do impact other species of wildlife in the Commonwealth.
Sure. And part of the numbers, we're far from that being a concern, right? We're far on the other end in terms of we maybe have too many hunters, not enough. Right.
I wouldn't say we have too many hunters, but we're doing well. We just don't want to do worse. It's like anything else in life,
and Bryan, the reason I keep asking is you keep saying well or worse in terms of more or less. And I don't know that Jeremy and I necessarily are looking at it that way. So I'm just trying to understand your perspective.
So your question,
because in some cases I would say less is better.
Well, it's an individual perspective. So
for sure,
your perspective and my perspective as an individual turkey hunter, I want less turkey hunters. But as a conservationist and somebody who values the hunting traditions and the value of hunting to society, I want to maintain our hunter numbers. I want us to maintain relevancy within the Commonwealth. Pennsylvania has a strong approval rating, even among non-hunters, of hunting. I want to maintain that. I want to maintain that culture. I want my kid who is a hunter, but I want him to be a hunter. I want his grandchildren to become hunters. I want him to experience the same things I do. 100%. So there's two ways of looking at that question. You as a individual hunter, yeah, we all want less competition, and we don't want anybody in the woods, and we want dumb turkeys gobbling all day long and running up to us, and it's great. But from a conservation standpoint, it's a different way to look at it. When you look at from the perspective of hunting as something that is a tradition that's going to be maintained here in this Commonwealth, that's going to be shared and passed on to future generations. So I look at that as a conservationist, as I want to keep people hunting. I want to keep as many people who have an interest in hunting out there in the woods. We can adjust seasons and bag limits to deal with, and we have biologists that work to make sure that we're not over harvesting the game. But I want to keep people engaged, and to me, which is something just core value of who I am and what I do.
Sure. Well, that makes perfect sense to me. And I guess the thing that I'm always like weighing that against is the quality of the experience, not just for the individual, but for everybody that's buying licenses. And so like, surely there is a breaking point. Not everybody can hunt. And while we would like to share that opportunity, we'd like to pass on the tradition, it's just not feasible 100% of the time.
It's because it's a limited resource.
It's a limited resource, as you said.
It's absolutely a limited resource. And when you look at the quality of the hunt too, I think part of some of the changes we've seen in hunting that have not been a good thing and not been a healthy thing. If you look at, an outdoor program's been great about, teaching new people how to hunt and getting them engaged in hunting.
Some of them.
But there's also some things in outdoor programming that have kind of taught hunters that is not necessarily very helpful to hunting. For example, if you want to hunt a big buck, all you need is a big old box stand sitting on the edge of a field spread with some magic seed mix that's going to grow some incredibly big, lush fields, and your big buck's going to come in there and you're going to shoot a 190 class buck. That's not a healthy way to look at hunting. And here's why. If you're only going to value hunting and enjoy hunting by the animals you take, you're missing the bigger picture experience and probably won't stay engaged in hunting unless you go to some special place where nobody else is hunting and nobody else is shooting deer. Iowa. It's the process of hunting that should be celebrated more than that microsecond of shooting that animal. That's just the point you get to during that hunt.
Yeah, there's no doubt.
It's everything else.
There's no doubt. But it is a factor, right? I'm not saying it's the only factor, but the quality of the animal that you can take is of interest to a percentage of the people.
I don't even know if I would argue it's the quality of the animal as much as it is in just from personal experience. If I bust my butt to go back and hike a mile up on a ridge, whether I'm turkey hunting or deer hunting, and right at daybreak, 6 other guys come marching through, that ruins the quality of the experience for me. And so,
yeah, me too.
Yeah, and so it's I think that there's a tipping point there, right? We probably aren't anywhere close to it. We weren't close to it in the 80s when we had way more hunters than we have now. But
and that's what you're saying right there is why I kind of prefaced my question to Bryan of like there's an animal resource and there's a land resource. Like there's literally we can only fit so many people on a tract of land, and there's only so many animals to be harvested. And that's why I'm kind of like just inquiring about. And I don't need a number from you, Bryan. I'm just trying to understand, like, what is the benchmark? What's the goal? Well,
and maybe,
so whether it's in my case to harvest a mature animal, or in your case to not see 6 guys, there's a number.
Well, I guess maybe
a mindset that helps.
The better question there, Bryan, would be: how does the Game Commission determine, let's say, the appropriate harvest within the state? Because that's going to factor in the animals, the habitat, the number of hunters.
Well, and it gives us a nice opportunity to look at another state who would say very, very strict with that. It would be like Iowa. People have to buy,
unless you're a resident,
4, 5, 6 points to be able to go in to hunt there, and we don't do that in Pennsylvania for a reason. And we're curious what that is essentially.
Yeah, so within every agency, we have what I refer to as species biologists. So we have biologists that are specifically trained that monitor. For example, we have a team that deals with whitetail deer, and their job is they go out and they'll put their hands on over 25,000 heads at processors, and they'll get the age of those deer. They'll get the information off the tag, and we'll use that information to come up with our harvest estimates. And they'll be able to look at that and trend through time to look what our harvest is. Same thing with, wild turkey. We do a number of things. We do banding surveys every year. So we'll capture gobblers, we'll put bands on them, and then we'll look at that harvest where it turns up in the harvest and the reporting to look at gobbler harvest. Same thing we do a game take survey, which is a large survey that's sent out to all hunters and ask them, how many deer did you get? Did you get a turkey? All those things. And what's interesting, especially when whitetail deer, when you look at the game take survey and then you look at the other ways we use for estimating deer harvest, the number comes out to be about the same, which makes perfect sense.
Yep.
If you understand surveys and how all that works, it makes perfect sense because we have a lot of confidence in that number. So we're able to look at in each wildlife. We're broken up here in Pennsylvania into what's called wildlife management units. So these are fairly areas that are very homogeneous in habitat. They're very similar, at least, and broken down. And we manage by those wildlife management units, and we have enough samples in there that we can come up with real numbers from a statistical standpoint to see where we're at with that population. So we have trained biologists in place that can help us ensure that we don't over harvest a population, which is, here in our April board meeting coming up, we'll have our biologists come up with the antlerless allocations that'll come before the board for approval. And those are based on real numbers that are measured out in the field to determine, based on the goals of the deer management plan in that wildlife management unit, what is our goal harvest the next year for does, for example, in this case. Same thing with our elk. We have a very strong survey. We actually use aircraft with the elk to survey the number of animals, and we have a really good, tight understanding of how many bulls and how many cows we have out there. So again, it comes back to the science, and all this is driven by the science. No matter what state agency you're talking about, we drive our decisions by what we can measure, and not necessarily what we think and what we hear, but what we can actually measure and know. Because in science, it's all about what you can measure. I get emails all day long, and I'll have 10 hunters tell me there's not a turkey left, and I'll have another 10 hunters saying, I don't know why you shortened the season, because we're overrun with turkeys. And it goes to tell you that us as an individual, that's our own observation of what we see. That doesn't necessarily and doesn't mimic what the Commonwealth is dealing with when it comes to wildlife. It's just what we happen to see that season.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I promise, no offense by this question. Let me figure out the way to ask it here. Would that also indicate like an agency's inability or ineffectiveness to have an effect at a larger level because of a number of factors? Like, so you guys are making decisions to say, we're going to allocate X number of tags or whatever it is that you're doing to lay out regulations. And then after that's done, you've got 10 people saying it's this way and you've got 10 people saying it's this way. Is that something that is potentially just simply out of your control?
No, it's simply reality.
Yeah.
For example, how many times have you gone turkey hunting in the morning and you heard 4 birds gobbling and your buddy's hunting 5 miles down the road? So he swears the aliens took him because he didn't hear a single gobbler in 3 days. It's just the reality of hunting. And it's usually where there's conflict between the agency and the hunters. It's because what they're seeing does not mesh with what we're able to measure and see. There's really no way around that, to be quite honest with you. The fact of the matter is, deer hunter, 25% of hunters are going to be successful. 75% of them are not going to be successful. Those numbers have been consistent for decade after decade after decade. Not everybody gets a deer. It's not the way it works. It takes us 1 in 4 on average antlerless licenses to harvest 1 doe. So the numbers are pretty consistent. Turkeys, same way, about 20% success rate. Some people get a turkey because they're more skilled. Some of them get them because they're more lucky. But the bottom line is, not everybody's going to get a turkey, and not everybody's going to see a ton of deer on opening day of deer season. Not everybody's going to hear a ton of gobblers, but there's going to be others that are going to see a ton of deer, and others going to see a ton of gobblers.
Maybe an example of, and that's a good way to answer that, Brian. I appreciate that. An example of what I'm talking about would be, one guy over here's got 1,500 acres that he hunts by himself or with a small group of guys, and they've got a strict management plan for that piece of property, and then 5 miles over here, you've got, 10 40-acre tracts, and every one of them gets hunted by somebody different and their brother. And there's an Amish community down the road. And, so they're obviously going to see two very different outcomes, based on the same regulation that you guys are putting out, assuming it's in the same management unit and stuff like that.
Sure.
And I'm not, I'm simply pointing in that and saying, is that maybe something that's just beyond your guys' control? Like, it's not something that you can have an influence on. Is that happening?
No, you can't manage down. Now, we have tools like DMAT, for example, that is there to assist landowners to deal with localized deer issues on their property. But as one of our commissioners used to say, you can't spread deer or turkeys or anything else like peanut butter. You're not going to evenly distribute them across the landscape, no matter what you do, because they're going to go to the habitats that are best for them, or there's a variety of reasons wildlife may be more common in one area and less common in another. Could be hunting pressure, could be habitat differences. It could be the makeup of the landscape between agriculture and big forest. There's 1,000,001 reasons of why wildlife would be in one area or not as seen as much in one area, not the other. You can't do anything about that. And you can't manage a species. I understand where you're trying to go. The question is, if we're able to manage to a smaller amount of level, could we have, improve what you're calling the quality? And the thing is, it's impossible to do that. You can only manage so far down. We have to look at as an agency, at least at the smallest level, being the wildlife management unit, what's the sustainable number of deer that we can manage for, given our goals for that wildlife management unit, knowing that there are going to be properties in there with tons of deer on them, 100 deer per square mile, and maybe a few pieces with 10 deer per square mile. There's nothing you can ever do to change that. It's impossible.
Yeah. And I think that's where you see a lot of the unrest, if it occurs, is that, somebody is just their hunting zone that they're in, or what they're willing to travel to or to hunt, is one of these areas that just maybe isn't favorable for turkeys or grouse or for deer or whatever it might be. And 5 miles down the road, there is an area that is much more favorable that is, loaded essentially. And so, it's we always say, you can't kill a big buck if he's not there. I mean, it's never more true, when you start to look at it from a property to property. It's just how willing is that hunter to go out there and find them, because to your point, there's a lot of public land out there. There's a lot of access land. There's you've got the co-op program as well for a private land access piece, which is something that, frankly, I still haven't taken advantage of. And I know plenty of guys, Eric and Angelo, like those guys.
Oh yeah, they get hit up. I've seen them.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just it's just more access, and typically you would think it's better quality because it's private land or farmland or whatever it might be, but it's just part of it.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I've come across a few of those. I mean, they're essentially, it's public land.
Mm-hmm.
I've hunted a few of them too. I mean, it gets hunted the same way as public land. You essentially, you could run into guys and, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I've talked to a lot of guys that have had negative experiences on public land, but I've also talked to a lot of guys who are killing and seeing bigger bucks in Pennsylvania in general than they ever have. And I think primarily that's on private land, but
I mean, Steve Shark's a great one.
All of this has an undertone, Brian, of obviously we don't blame you for or give you too much credit for any of this. They're just purely observations.
Well, it's wildlife. I mean, I hunt primarily public land, primarily game lands, because of the intensive management that we do on our game lands. And I have no problem finding turkeys. Some days I don't hear any. Other days it's like, wow, where have I been?
Wow. Here, I'm going to catch flack for this one, but that's turkeys. Like turkeys are everywhere. We're talking about white-tailed deer, an elite species of animal here.
If you know a place where there's no deer, I want you to come show me, because I'm still looking for that place. Because I can take you to places.
Raccoon Creek State Park, where there's 15 trucks loaded up every day. That'd be my go-to.
Yeah, I can take you to Elk County, to game lands where people say no deer, and I can take you out with our land managers. We can't get a tree to grow because the deer have eaten every single seedling in that forest. Mm-hmm. Now, when you get into the northern tier of Pennsylvania, you get a lot of topography that hunters do not want to get into. You get these nice flat tops and steep sides. Well, guess where all the deer are? They're hiding on those steep sides. And that's the other thing about white-tailed deer. You say, well, there's no deer. And you got to get to where they're going. Again, we don't spread them out like peanut butter. It's not kind of like stocking trout, where I got to put trout in every single big hole so the fishermen can go get there. The deer move on their own, and they're going to go where you're not, because they're survivalists. They've been doing this game a lot longer than we have, and they know how to play this game.
Speaking my language now, Brian. You're speaking my language now, yeah.
I'm going to pivot us just briefly, because you had to bring up the trout side. Pennsylvania is very unique in that, Brian, you essentially have counterparts at the Fish and Boat Commission, and then even at the DCNR level, where a lot of states, that's kind of an all-in-one aspect. And again, it's the crowds you run around with, but from a public perspective, I hear a lot of people say, well, like, how can that be efficient? Like, if we look at all these other states, Iowa, Kansas, even Illinois, they have a DNR. It's a single entity that's managing a lot of this, and we've got 3, right? I mean, obviously, I assume you work really well with your counterparts, but I mean, there has to be challenges in that as well.
Absolutely not. It's actually a big, huge benefit, and I'll tell you why. So when you look at, there's basically 2 different models to agency structure in the United States. The model that is here in Pennsylvania is the model that was first recommended in the 1930s for how to structure a wildlife agency as an independent agency. So it's not the word independent. You got to be careful how you think about that. What it means is I have a board of commissioners that are nominated by the governor, approved by the Senate, and they are responsible for setting seasons and bag limits. Now, here in Pennsylvania, Fish Commission was born before us. So that's why there was a Fish Commission first, and then the Game Commission was added much later. And we are the only state with 2 different agencies. However, it allows both agencies to spend a lot more time dealing with policy issues, both within the wildlife arena and separately in the fisheries arena. If you look at Pennsylvania and the natural resources we have, to be quite honest with you, we have more natural resources here in Pennsylvania than most states have. You look at the thousands of miles of streams of brook trout waters, for example, that we have in Pennsylvania. It's amazing. And then when you look at all the lands we have available in the rich wildlife, everything from bear to deer to turkey to woodcock to, well, ruffed grouse somewhat. But, we have a lot of richness here in the state. So when you look at the other model, which is a super agency model, so DCNR, that's where you're going to be dealing with state parks. The key here is there's no overlap in our business between DCNR, Pennsylvania Game Commission, and Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. There's no overlap. So the only way you're going to have inefficiencies is when you have an overlap of duties. So we're doing something that Fish and Boat would be doing, and we don't. What's key, though, is we can focus on the issues far more. And what happens in typical wildlife agencies that I feel bad about when they are combined, which is all of them are, is that there's so much attention put to white-tailed deer and turkey and bear, and not as much or not enough attention is put on the aquatic issues in comparison to the other species that are popular to hunt. The other thing, too, then you've got this super agency model. Then super agency model would be, for example, if you took Pennsylvania Game Commission, Fish and Boat, and put us under DCNR. So the situation you've got there then it is headed by a secretary who's a political appointee, then changes out every time you get a new governor. So you look at Maryland or Jersey, what do you got down there as far as governors and what do they think of hunting? Those are the dangers that you get into. As far as efficiencies, we're a very, very small agency, and so is Fish and Boat Agency, very efficient at what we do and are able to carry out our mission very, very well. When you look at that more super agency model, and then when you look at agencies that have struggled the most with things like CWD, there are agencies that are dealing with CWD that because the governor is over, really, their secretary is over the agency, they're not allowed to talk about CWD. They're not going to do anything about CWD because the politics don't allow it to do. This is why the model of the state agency as an independent agency was first recommended by Aldo Leopold in the 1930s, was to try to provide some type of buffer. We still have to be accountable to legislators. We still have to be accountable to the public, but there's got to be some barrier that allows science to drive the decision-making instead of pure politics. Look at South Carolina. Who sets their seasons and bag limits? Legislature. Guess which state's having a trouble with their turkeys because they can't get their season set right because all the hunters are screaming because they want it earlier and it's interrupting with the breeding cycle. Yeah. So you can see where that those politics get in the way of science. When politics get in the way of science, you get utter disaster. It's kind of like, I told my kid, you can pick anything you want to eat and all he's going to have is cake. And well, now he's 27, so he's going to have beer and cake. He needs to eat something healthy, and as hunters, we know what we want. And the hunters in South Carolina were clear, hey, we hear more birds gobbling in the spring. We want the season earlier and earlier and earlier. Well, now they've interfered with their breeding, and other southern states are suffering from that same dilemma. So I would argue that, sitting here, right here in this office, I work with Tim Schaefer, the executive director of Pennsylvania Fish Boat Commission. We work very well together, but our jobs and what we do are very distinct and very dissimilar. And same thing with DCNR. And I work with Secretary Dunn, who's just an outstanding individual. And the challenges and things they do are very distinct and different from what we do. But as a team, we work very well together and deliver our missions, which are different. So to give you an example, DCNR has, state forest lands, much different mission on state forest lands compared to game lands. State forest, they're looked at for commercial forestry practices. That's part of what they do, and they do a great job with it. Pennsylvania Game Commission on our 1.6 million acres of state game lands, completely different mission. Our focus is on what? Wildlife and hunting and trapping. That's what we do. That's why you'll see more infrastructure developed for mountain biking, snowmobiling, ATV riding on your state forest. And you won't see that on Pennsylvania the Game Commission game lands because we're focused on wildlife, hunting, trapping, and wildlife.
Well, and Bryan, you can't tell me that the general hunting public doesn't give you guys a lot of flack when they're hunting state forest and they're having issues not seeing deer or stuff. It seems like I don't want to say a lack of communication. It's just an unawareness of the efforts that each of these divisions in the state are providing. And so, like, if you go out, for instance, I got Forbes State Forest in 20 minutes from here. That has a completely different mission than if I go on the State Game Lands 51, which is right next door.
Yeah, and you still have good deer hunting on both of them. There's still deer there.
Yep.
If you're going on game lands, you're going to probably see a lot more early successional habitat. You're going to see a lot more use of prescribed fire. And, in those areas, you may have a harder time finding deer just because it's thicker and denser and the deer can hide a little bit better. But there's still, even though the state forest focuses on commercial timber, and on plant diversity and things like that. They still do a wonderful job, and it's still great wildlife habitat. I'm so glad that we have it. I hunt on a lot of state forests, had some wonderful turkey hunts and deer hunts on state forest. My deer camp is on state forest. I belong to a traditional state lease camp. Now the deer where I'm at, because of the infiltration of mountain laurel and rocks, it's not very good deer hunting. It's almost impossible to deer hunt. But one of the things I'm willing to do that maybe many hunters struggle with is I'll go to where the deer are. I'll get in my car from my camp, and I may go 3 miles down the road to where I see more deer sign, which is what I do, and am very successful at it when it comes to deer hunting up there. But I got to know where the deer are, find where the deer are, and then I got to actually go to where the deer are.
Yep.
Interesting comparison between Bryan and I in this past season where I killed my buck.
I know, right?
Yeah. So I've got a family farm in Ohio that I've said this a billion times in the podcast. I'm sorry, everybody. But just the quality of deer is we overhunt it, and there's a lot of neighboring pressure and stuff. And so I've had to go down the road a couple of miles to find the
better
booners
deer
that I'm after.
Yeah, better deer. I think it's an interesting thing because, and thank you for that kind of really well broken down independent agency analysis there, because it's one of the things that, I hear a lot from people, mainly because I do hunt next to or on a lot of state forest ground, and frankly, they immediately blame the game commission, right? And you got
to blame somebody.
Well, I know, and it's not going to be themselves, of course, but like,
no, it could be that
they immediately blame you guys for it. And it's like, and I think it's just because the mindset is like, well, it's because of them, right? They manage this stuff, and the public just doesn't know. And if there's one, I guess call it a criticism, Bryan, but obviously don't take it personal. If there's one criticism I have of the state is I know that you guys have some really great species biologists in-house, but I think the public just doesn't get to hear from them that often. And I get why, and honestly, like any of them looking back to what, Gary Alt went through probably thinks, yeah, there's reasons I'm not marching to every, high school gym across the state to do that. But it's just in a way of, I know that these guys and girls are very smart at what they do. And they are, they care so much about the resource that all of us in the general hunting community care about. It's just, how do we hear from them more, I guess?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair criticism too. I know our biologists have been trying to get out more now with COVID. Everything's been kind of shut down. We've had a lot of new biologists on board. We've had a lot of changes in the agency in the next 5 years, and we do have we have a new bear biologist, and as they are now, and a new deer biologist. We have a lot of new staff in our Bureau of Wildlife Management. But yeah, we do. That's a fair criticism. To our biologists need to get out more. They do. I mean, absolutely, because it's not like the Gary Alt days. The Gary Alt days was a different time and place.
It's crazy. I mean,
those deer war days are so far behind us and done with. I'm so glad. As far as people complaining and blaming stuff on the Game Commission, it's a culture. Like I mentioned before, it's kind of cultural. There's some great article I think came out of Wisconsin that the whole thrust of the article was about how popular it was in hunting camps to sit and just blame whether it's Wisconsin DNR
100%.
or Pennsylvania Game Commission and that's what they do. And their kids are brought up to do that. I don't understand it, because if I go out and I go hunting and I don't see a deer, I'm not blaming the Game Commission. I haven't done my legwork to find out where those deer are there. Those turkey are there. Those ducks are there. Those species are there. I just haven't done my job as a hunter to go find them. Now, we're not running a hunting preserve and if you look at our hunter surveys, for example, what hunters' expectations on deer, what they've extrapolated, estimated is that hunters would like to see 30 deer a day. That is a tremendous amount.
Yeah, me too,
bro.
And
I'd like to see 100 deer a day, but I do know I can't sustainably manage for other species of wildlife with a deer population that's that high. You simply just can't do it, nor will agriculture be able to sustain that, or they tolerate that. The public's not going to tolerate, because, the deer eating their shrubs, and we have enough problems with that as it is now. And, the forestry community being able to grow trees, and it's those new young trees which become the forest when we finally harvest those. So it's a very complex dynamic. But, I take responsibility for myself. If I didn't hear a turkey or see a deer, that's my fault, because I didn't put the homework or the legwork or have some luck to succeed that day.
Well, and I think what's interesting, and Jared and I find us in this situation a lot, is we're 365 day a year managers. Like we're, we're out there, doing timber stand improvement on private property or leases. We're finding sheds. We're learning what's out there. We're just in the woods all the time. And it's because, it's much more than that, side hobby, right? I mean, it literally is a lifestyle for us and our families. And I think what's interesting is we start to get put into these, I don't know, call it a bucket basically, where it's like, well, there's those guys. They own private land. They're doing all this management. They're planting food plots. And basically they're hoarding a deer.
Doing anything we can to avoid public land.
Well, yeah, and I mean, but it's also because, and it's not to say that you can't do things on public land 365 days a year. It's just like
literally you can't.
I enjoy the off-season management and activity to try to make better habitat as much as I do the hunting aspect in the fall.
I had the same experience in South Carolina because I had to have a lease for the most part. And I planted food plots, and somebody had a tractor, so you had to have access to that. And we planted food plots. I used to go around, ride around and check on them, see how they're growing, and do soil, pH, and look at the soil pH and do the amendments and the fertilizer and then the herbicide later in the season. I had a lot of fun with that. Even did some prescribed burning down there because in the South, of course, prescribed fire is a big deal, and we have more flexibility to do it. So we used to do a lot of prescribed burn and work with the foresters who would come in and do the timber management, and they would help us with fire lines and things like that. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. In Pennsylvania, if you're lucky to have, private ground where you can do that, man, more power to you, man. That's great. I don't think there should be a jealousy or a class envy between hunters who have access to a real nice piece of private land and those who don't. I myself don't have that access, but I'm still lucky in that I got 6 million other acres to pick from. So what do I got to complain about?
Yeah. Well, and it's a weird thing, and it's not just Pennsylvania, right? It's a nationwide kind of thing, which has been this like public hunter, private hunter divide, which is a really weird thing because, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago on a podcast, like some of the private property that I own borders public land. And so like, obviously the deer aren't just living on my place. In fact, most of the time they're bedded on public and they may be coming and feeding on my property. And so they coexist together. And so I think and it kind of fishtails us back into that hunter number discussion, but it's because maybe jealousy, call it, in that we can control who hunts our property and how it's hunted. Whereas, some of those guys I know work really hard and they hike way back up in there. And there's still a chance that other people are going to come in and bump deer and ruin the hunt, I guess, because it's public land. Well, you can't control it.
That private landowner has the ability to influence like how their property hunts. And in some cases, the deer that are there, not 100%, obviously, because like you said, those deer can come and go. But maybe it does sound weird to say that it's jealousy. But like, dude, I would even say as somebody who's hunted public land, like I've been jealous of those private landowners. I would say, man, that property is where I want to be. For those reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
it's been my experience though, on the leases that I was a member of in the South, I had more hunter density on my private property because it took us that many leasees to be able to pay
for it
for the lease. As what I see my experience is sounds like it's a little bit different than you all. I have not been overrun by hunters. I haven't been overrun by turkey hunters, deer hunters. They're there. I know they're there. And I pick where I go to try to lessen that opportunity of an interaction. But I'm not finding the other hunters, for the most part, ruining my experience out there. Deer season, I don't care if there's 5 guys that walk past me. That's fine. I have no problem with that at all. In fact, I'm glad to see it because I know them walking by me may push out some deer. And I know where turkey hunters will go and where they won't go. And I just kind of plan accordingly. So, I've had great experience. Again, I primarily just hunt public land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's where
for sake of like seeing eye to eye on this stuff, Brian, and for the conversation to like progress, as far as like the deer hunting thing, like I completely disagree with that. Like that would ruin my hunt. If I saw 5 guys walking past, I would be like, this
depends when you're hunting. If you're archery hunting, I wouldn't like it. But general gun season,
sure. Well, and I think we're to the point in the conversation where during the archery season, we are experiencing that on public land. And I think that's frankly the reason that we want to have the conversation at all.
Yeah.
And that's, you're exactly right, Brian. I think we can't control the animals that are there. These are living, breathing things that God made, and they're jumping around wherever they want to go, and they can live as long as they can survive. Mm-hmm. But in terms of like the experiences that we have encountering other hunters or not, and that being tied to the quality of the experience, it seems like at least Jeremy and I, and a majority, I would say, of the people that we've talked to have seen a and I'll preface that by maybe the deer hunting is still good, but the quality of the experience has decreased because of the number of people that they're running into during the archery season.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that could happen. I think the other thing we got to look at hunters, because going back to your question, and I think this is really what this all centered around: do we really want more hunters? And it's a really great, engaging conversation to have. I think the other caution I would offer, though, is when you look at our numbers as far as the age of hunters and when they come in and when they leave hunting, when they hit that 65, 70, 75-year-old, we're not seeing enough younger hunters come in the pipeline. So when you don't have that number of new, it's no different than not having enough young deer born into the population. What happens?
Yep.
You don't have hardly any deer. So being able to sustain, engage those younger hunters is going to be really important to at least keep the status quo where we're having. We're not having an over harvest issues in Pennsylvania when it comes to white-tailed deer. We've got good quality animals. We've got some areas that are crowded, some areas that are, you can find that are still not crowded.
Mm-hmm. I think that was going to be one of my questions on the hunter side is, when we even look in the last couple of years, we see this swing in numbers going back up. Who are they? Who are those people? Is it reactivation, like people who quit hunting and now they had time and they're like, I'm going to start hunting again? Is it brand new people? Is it apparently it's not youth, it sounds like.
Well, it's a combination of the two. Now, youth are a different animal altogether because youth hunters are completely dependent on somebody else taking them hunting. They don't have a car. They can't hunt by themselves. So you got to kind of separate the youth part of it. But when you look at your independent hunters, you say, 16, 18 and older hunters, what we're seeing, we saw through the pandemic is, and from our surveys with the Saturday opener and the Sunday hunting was, we saw a lot of reactivation of hunters who hadn't hunted in quite a while that said, hey, this is more opportunity for me. I'm going to get re-engaged. And we only surveyed hunters over 18 years old in that survey because, again, under that age, it's a different world you're dealing with. You're dealing with kids that might be still in college, or still in high school, and it's just gets to be problematic. But we're seeing a lot of brand new hunters. Look at the Duck Dynasty. Remember that show when it was out and very popular, and all the new duck hunters that got brought to the table. We had that same thing with the pandemic. I remember hearing one of the officers tell me a story. He saw a guy sitting in the middle of the field yapping on a turkey call with no cover or whatever, just sitting on a stool in the middle of the field. Well, obviously, this is a person who's never turkey hunted and just didn't know what to do, but he got out there and tried it. I mean, and that's great, man. Get out there and put on your boots and go out there and have some fun.
Well, I think to the conservation point, the thing that we have to keep in mind when we talk about hunter numbers is, there's a chunk of federal funding that comes into the state, and hunter numbers are a portion of that factor, correct?
Well, they are, but if every state goes down, it probably doesn't change for the individual agency. It probably doesn't affect that funding source because if all of them are coming down, it's divided by land area number of hunters. But if all the states come down like they have been, you're probably not going to see a big change there. The bigger side of it, though, is, what about the industry side of it? Hunting is about a $1.2 billion industry in Pennsylvania just alone. What about all those private businesses that rely on hunting for their business, whether you're manufacturing bows or you have a bed and breakfast up there in Elk County, so there's a lot of businesses that rely on hunting, like you guys had brought up earlier, that is dependent on this. So it's, do we, try to put the brakes on it and have fewer hunters because it's going to give us less competition for a turkey at the expense of an equonomy and at the expense of bringing new people into this fold, just because we have hunters really don't want competition for that. I mean, I think that's, a quandary. I know where I sit personally on that, but I think it's an individual feeling as far as where you come from on that perspective, which I think it was, his name was Matt Rennell. I think it was an interesting article, at least in a discussion purposes. Hey man, we're all entitled to our opinion, and I love to hear good discussion and good thought.
Yeah, and I think that's where our kind of standpoint is. That it's like we're not actively going out there and saying like we don't want any more hunters.
100%,
no more.
Well, let me say this, dude. I think we've got a lot of overlap in what we're saying, and that we're not even saying there needs to be less hunters. We're purely looking at it and making an observation that during the archery season, we've seen a lot more crossbow hunters specifically on public land, and at the same time, we're not saying hey there should be less crossbow hunters. Not at all. It just seems like. And that's one specific example. It seems like to maintain the quality of that experience, not as it relates to the animals, but as it relates to the human interaction, that it may make sense to have special considerations for a different weapon class, such as crossbows, or use any weapon in that. And so the result that I'd be looking for there would be ultimately you guys have a goal for the amount of animals that should be harvested, the amount of people that should be on different pieces of land at a certain point during the season. it seems unbalanced at this point towards the archery season. And the most recent change on that has been the introduction of crossbows into that season.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I could just see it now in the papers. Is well, if you have a separate vertical bow and a separate crossbow, that's the way you do it. Let's face it, that's what we're talking about. If you separate those two and have separate seasons, or who gets to go first?
Yeah, sure. And I'm open to that. I guess. And I could be dead wrong, but so tell me how you guys are looking at this. You know, obviously there is a difference in is lethality the right word to use there? You know, effectiveness. Archery currently has a much longer season than firearm does, right? And I assume it's because you can kill a lot more deer a lot faster and more effectively
and there's more licensed hunters
with a rifle than you can.
Season, at least in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and 100%, I won't accept an argument on this. Crossbows is the same way compared to a vertical bow. You could kill more deer faster at a further distance with less experience than a crossbow. 100%. Nothing against those people that are shooting
on this point then.
Okay.
Since we're sitting around the fire, let's look at data. So what you look at the proportion of vertical bow hunters to crossbow hunters, they're taking about proportionally the same number of deer. So your crossbow hunters aren't taking more deer any sizable amount than your vertical bow hunters. Okay.
Is there the same number of them though, Brian? Is there 50% bow hunters and 50%?
It's pretty close. It's like 54 to 48 or something like that. It's pretty close. Okay. Oh. Now let's look at, so that's data. That tells us that.
That's new data to us. We're happy to hear it.
That's good. That's what we want. That's what we want.
Data's good. So when we look at that, it doesn't show us that the crossbow hunters are proportionally shooting more deer or are more successful than your vertical bow hunters.
Okay.
Now let's look at the practicality. And this is where I get frustrated with how the industry is marketing some of these crossbows. There's no question in an open field situation with nice cut short grass and a no wind day that you can put a target out there at 100 yards and you can whack it and hit it all day long.
No question.
But that's not where we're hunting. We're hunting an area with sticks and twigs and everything else. And in fact, it's unethical for a hunter to think that they can take a crossbow out there and perform at 100 yards. It's completely unethical.
100%.
We've had articles in Game News about it. We've had online posts about it to try to educate hunters that, you know, the manufacturers may tell you can shoot 100 yards and they can in an open field, but that's not where you're hunting.
We're 100% on the bad of outdoor media.
We're 100% on the same page with that, Brian.
I know. I figured we would.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, and this is where they're not everybody, but a lot of outdoor media is pushing that and saying, here's this new 10-point. It's 505 feet per second. You can shoot 125 yards with it. Well, that's not ethical.
Well, whether they are or they're not, that weapon specifically, and I've shot them. It will give you the confidence that you could do it. I've shot that crossbow and said I could probably shoot something at 80 yards with that.
I know, and I don't. That's where I think the issue lies, and it's interesting to hear those numbers, Brian, because I mean to hear that the success ratios are essentially
before
the same.
We move on from that, how has that changed, Brian, over let's say the past 5 years? So you're saying currently we roughly have 50% crossbow hunters and 50% bow hunters,
roughly.
So I assume at one point, how long ago was crossbows introduced to the archery season?
Man, I'm trying to think back. It had to have been at least maybe 15 years ago, but I'm guessing at that. And I don't have any current trend numbers on crossbows. What I'm finding being out with the field with hunters is that typically a lot of the hunters that are getting into the crossbows are those. I shoot a vertical bow and that's all I shoot. I have no interest, but I have nothing against crossbows, but I'll put the practice into it and I'll go out and I'll shoot. What I'm finding with the crossbow hunters, it's often people who don't have the time, because you can take a crossbow sighted in without practice. You can, if you pick the right distance, have a very ethical, good kill, because those things are dead on.
That's a lethal weapon, 100%.
Yeah. I mean, they're really good. And that's a good thing. We want ethical shots. We don't want animals running around the landscape. That's 100%. Not what we want. But
that would be the argument against recurves, which we've had as well.
Well,
we're getting crucified from all ends here.
I used to shoot a recurve. And again, as long as you pick your shots, any implement we use to harvest game can be done effectively and efficiently if you recognize your limits. And how many of us have heard those, through our lives, heard that guy said, well, I just kind of lobbed one out there. That is completely unethical and should never
100%.
happen. And never should happen. But the crossbows, what I'm finding is a lot of your older hunters who can no longer hunt with a vertical bow are picking up the crossbow, and your guys that just don't have the time to dedicate to spending the time learning a vertical bow. So what it means is more opportunity for more people to be out there and enjoy it. Now, I understand and can appreciate the conflict that can at times occur when we run into other people in the archery woods. I get that.
Well,
I grew up as a bow hunter. That's my thing. I love it.
Us too, man. And it's not that I don't gun hunt, but I mean, we live to bow hunt. And one of the reasons it came up, Bryan, is we had a guy from Wisconsin send us some data from those guys. And basically, it looked at the vertical bow versus crossbow over the last 15 years is what I'm looking at here. And in 2020, crossbow hunters took 10,000 more antlered deer than vertical bow hunters. And it's been on an upward trajectory since it was introduced in 2014, whereas their vertical bow numbers have plateaued and or are decreasing since 2014. So it was just a really interesting, and again, it's not to target the crossbow side. It's just, again, from a limited resource discussion point, it's like, okay, we just brought in, what I think, and I'm glad you have the data to back it up. I would have said, there's no way that you can't tell me that the crossbow is a not more effective way of harvesting deer. But if the data is supporting 50-50, so be it.
No, it's ballpark, because I don't have it.
Well, no.
I get this question all the time.
Yeah, ballpark. It's ballpark.
Well, but Bryan, you agree that a crossbow it takes less skill to kill an animal with a crossbow than it does a vertical bow.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
And so because of that, while I agree, it's a very lethal weapon, and that's something that we want. The double-edged sword that I think we're like circling around is that inherently it would encourage or enable people to, take unethical shots,
like a false confidence.
Yeah, but we got to watch that, because the vertical guys, we still have that.
Oh, they will too.
There's no doubt.
100%.
There's no doubt. We're not innocent of that either.
Yeah, plenty of guys trying to weave an arrow 80 yards through hardwoods in Pennsylvania.
But
yeah, I'll give you maybe an analogy that makes sense to me at least. We don't limit cars to physically not be able to drive faster than 70 miles an hour,
Correct.
which is about the fastest you can drive. No, we got cars that'll do 110 miles an hour. Yep. So anybody can be unethical and mishandle a vehicle because it has the potential to do it. It's up to us to use ethics and follow the law to do it right.
So who would you hold, I know who I would, but a question would be, who would you hold accountable to better educate these people who are entertaining crossbows to avoid false confidence? Is it the industry?
Do you think it's an education issue?
100%. Well, it's not an education as much as it's misleading. The fact that the job of these companies and
I think it's more than that, dude. I think it's a temptation. I think this thing can do it. Like Bryan's saying with the car, it's like I don't know. To use your analogy, it's like using cars in a bike lane. You know what I mean? It's like it's not the same thing. It's a different thing. Does that make sense? Like
giving me a Ford Fiat versus a Corvette. I'm still going to do 55 miles an hour in both of them. But what is going to be? But you asked a really good question, Jeremy, about who's responsible for that. I think it's a shared responsibility between the industry, the outdoor media, the wildlife agencies, anybody who's advocating for hunting. I think we all share a responsibility of reinforcing the hunters, because I can't do it all by myself as an agency. We're not a big media empire like those are out there. We don't have a huge marketing department like 10 Point would have or somebody else would have. We need help educating hunters that although these are very efficient and can be very ethical ways to harvest deer, you got to do it right and realize that the limitations. So when you do the physics behind arrow drop and things like that with a recurve, and there's a lot of drop there. You get the same drop. You get drop as well in a vertical bow, but the equipment's usually a little bit lighter. Yeah,
and I mean, don't get me wrong. I think as a weapon, crossbows are the number one weapon for recruitment, and I say that because like I'm bringing 2 young boys into the hunting community right now.
Well, and let's be clear. That's because they're the easiest to kill deer with, and they offer the most opportunity now that they overlap with archery season. So it makes sense that that's the case.
And whether you're a new hunter or you're a youth, it doesn't matter. You don't have to fear a recoil from a gun, and getting knocked in the face with a scope. And you also don't have to invest the time into being proficient with a compound bow. And frankly, as a youth, like my kids couldn't lethally kill anything with a compound bow. They're pulling 30 pounds.
Which in fairness is at least debatable, right? Like some people might say I don't think that's right. They should have to practice with a compound bow and get to a point where they can kill it with it. It's at least debatable, right?
Mm-hmm. It is. But in the society that we live in, I want my kids to get into the hunting community as ethically fast as possible, and the crossbow is the pathway.
Yeah, and it's legal. So, yeah, I support it. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, they'll graduate to vertical bows because they want to shoot those. They're just like, it would be unethical of me to put them in a stand and let them try to kill a deer with a vertical bow right now because it's not lethal.
Right.
Or they're not ready skill-wise. So what do? Do you hold them back to not participate, or do you
Which is what we did, right?
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't hunt until
I didn't hunt until I was 12.
12. Yep. Mm-hmm. There was no mentored season, which, again, I'm...
Well, and you're not supposed to hunt until you're 16 without your adult, like in the tree.
Yep.
But my dad said, your tree's that way.
Yeah, go that way. And I mentioned earlier about, kind of the Gary Alt movement being as one of the greatest single changes. I may take that statement back and say that the mentored hunting is probably one of the greatest single changes in the state of Pennsylvania. Because by the time a child gets to 12 years of age in today's society, that's a tough pull to get them to want to go hunting.
Yeah, it is. And, I know it goes back to that too many hunters thing, but, as quickly as things can come around, things can also go away. And all you got to do is, again, go to our website, look at the license data. There's a chart there. You can do the math yourself and normalize that line and look at, how far down low do we want to get. For folks like us who are never going to stop hunting, we'd probably individually be in a better spot because we don't have the competition. Mm-hmm. But where's conservation going to be when you look at the big picture of everything that it takes to fund wildlife conservation, to carry out conservation in the United States?
Well, and I think it's an interesting point in terms of those hunter numbers because number one, it ties into the experience, right? If people have bad experiences on public land as a whole, those numbers will drop because people just will be like, I'm not doing this anymore. I can't hunt there, can't hunt here, can't hunt there. I'm just going to stop. I think the other thing that's kind of critical when you kind of look at those numbers across the board in terms of where they are, we're not, I mean, Bryan, how far off are we from, let's say, the peak of like the 80s or like 82 when we started to really drop? I mean, we're
1.2 million hunters. So, we're not off that many. So you're talking about 350,000 hunters.
But it's not
that many.
Here's what has changed is nobody in this state can argue that there are not bigger bucks today than there were in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s. I mean, in fact, the buck that was just published for scoring out in, I think it was Center County, Bryan, 217-inch gross monster. Like, I'm sure a deer like that existed in the state in the 80s and 90s, but I mean, he buried himself under every rock and downstream.
We didn't have crossbows then.
well, picture this. So picture that $1.2 million hunters. Now let's go back to, say, 50s, 60s, even through the 70s.
Yep.
There weren't hardly any deer in the southern tier of Pennsylvania. Imagine all those deer hunters going to that north central area to try to what it must have been like. You talk about hunters.
Yeah.
We're spread out statewide with deer hunters now. Back then, they had to go to the Northwoods. That's the only place there was deer. Can you imagine how crowded it was?
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Something is going right though, because we've decreased.
Hey, you guys are doing something right.
I'll
give you some credit here.
Yeah, we've decreased hunters a little bit here, right? And we're talking over a 30-year time period. But and again, I know it's not all about the antler, but frankly, that's what kind of motivates a lot of us. Like, there are better quality deer, not just in antler size, but in age, which is what typically, like, I'm looking to harvest a mature deer. I don't care if he scores 100 inches or 180 inches. Like, yeah, the 180 is awesome. I want to kill a 5-year-old buck in Pennsylvania because that's a freaking challenge. And there are more of them today than there have probably ever been in the last 100 years.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah, absolutely. I mean,
perception.
Average deer died at 1.5 years old.
I know.
Back in the 80s.
So something
85% of them were
something
killed.
Is moving in the right direction. And I guess, Bryan, like, what is it? Is it because there is more education? Like, is that one thing outdoor media is doing well and saying, like, hey, if you don't shoot this deer at 1, he'll be a bit bigger at 2 and then bigger at 3? Or are there other things that work here that we're not taking into effect that say, like, this is where, because there are guys that are now talking about, hey, I might actually go hunt Pennsylvania. They surely are doing it for turkey. But now they're starting to say it for deer.
Well, I'm one of them. Yeah.
Because Jared historically has gone to Ohio every year and just said, forget Pennsylvania. And now it's like, a guy just told you the other day, hey, behind the gym, there's a bunch of 160s on that hill.
Yeah. I haven't bought a tag, Brian, for, I don't know, 8 or 10 years. It's been a long time. I've just been going to my family farm and stuff. But for the first time ever, I'm excited to come back to Pennsylvania. It's obviously my home state. And I've got a lot of ties here. And I want to be able to do that here because it's a challenge and because now, I don't know if it's for the first time ever to say if that's right, but it seems like it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, it killed that deer in the state.
Yeah, and Jeremy's killed some nice deer here as well. So I think that there's some room in the conversation for quality deer management. And I know that there's, even we've seen recently, there's a lot of people, especially on the deer camp side of things, who value that tradition, saying that has ruined hunting. You know, that would be their perspective. They would say, you know, the stance that you've taken towards trying to harvest mature deer and anything that would entail has had a negative effect overall.
Concurrent doe and buck seasons.
And I would say it seems like kind of somewhere in the middle. You have like individual and independent landowners who value those practices. And I would say that primarily that's where you're going to see these giant Pennsylvania deer. But at the same time, you've got a lot of hunting opportunity, you know, on the public lands at the same time. So it seems like we're seeing both things kind of at the same time.
Guy killed that giant in Tioga County on public lands. Steve Shirk obviously kills a ton up.
There's no doubt. Yeah, guys are killing big bucks here.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess that. What's the question there for Brian in terms of?
No, there's no question. I was just talking.
You're talking about the trophy hunting, and I hate to see us hunters. If somebody likes to hunt trophy deer, what is wrong with that? You're setting your own limits on your hunt. That's completely up to you. We should never be pitting ourselves. You know, developing deer, if you got a piece of property and you have the ability to manage it and you want to make sure you take a good number of does and you're selecting above and beyond what APRs are requiring you to do, why would anybody be upset with that hunter? I think that's just a dumb thing to argue about. You know, you hunt the way you like to hunt, as long as it's within the rules and regulations.
I can tell you why, Brian. It's because those guys perceive, you know, whoever's leading the charge on it. And I can say, because I've been that guy and I've had to realize, like, maybe I'm pushing this a little too far. You know, those goals in some cases supersede the relationships that exist in those camps and whoever, to surrounding neighbors and stuff. And I've been a culprit of that. I've been the one that's saying, hey man, it's like, you got to shoot a deer like this, or, you know, you can't hunt here, that type of deal. And I've realized, like, hey, that's not who I want to be.
It's not everything about the hunt and the camaraderie aspect of it.
Right. And so I can see both sides. You know, you want to manage some land for quality deers or quality deer and animals, but you also want to retain friendships, and those should be the priority.
Well, if you look at our statewide goals of antler point restrictions, really that's what they're really geared at is producing quality animals. You know, hunter surveys show they want bigger, heavier quality animals. And what that means is you've got to keep the number of deer out there within the limitations of what the habitat can do to support them. Now, that's different than, say, trophy racks, which, you know, is a different discussion altogether because, well, how are you going to get that? Well, you need food, you need age, and you need nutrition. But, you know, we look at some of the, like Jeremy said, you know, some of the biggest bucks we're taking is actually on state forest land. Why? Because, you know, they have DMAP in some of those areas. They keep the deer numbers to a reasonable level. There's adequate food. The deer aren't starving to death in the wintertime because they've got adequate level to get them through. They have a chance because it's big woods and people aren't getting that deep into a lot of these woods. They get a chance to get old. So they got old, they got fat, and Pennsylvania always has good deer genetics. The fact people say they argue Pennsylvania doesn't have good genetics. That's just not true at all.
No,
Pennsylvania has wonderful genetics.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what's so interesting in it is because we saw that struggle. I mean, people, you know, after Gary Alton and the changes happened, like I remember the first time, like I saw a group of 2-year-olds in like a soybean field. It was like, holy cow, like look at all those big bucks, you know? And it's just because, you know, you were used to shooting the first one-horn spike that came, you know, plowing through with a group of 30 does. The thing that really started to get to now is that, I mean, there are truly, and whether it's for trophy hunting or not, there are truly trophy quality whitetails being harvested every year in this state. And you know, it's not in just isolated events now either. Like you see across the state, it doesn't matter if you're in Lancaster County or you're in Washington County or you're up near Erie. I mean, everywhere across the state, there's the chance to shoot, you know, a Boone and Crockett Club buck. In 20 years ago, we would have laughed at that.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's why so many people threw a fit about the change, was because they're like, well, it's never going to happen here. All you're doing is just ruining my deer hunting, because that's never going to happen. Here we are 20 years later, and there are plenty of deer that are being killed over 150 inches in the state of Pennsylvania every year.
I look back to my first deer I got was on Bald Eagle State Forest at my camp on state forest land. I remember going up as a kid, so this probably would have been about 1982, 83. Buck came up, I shot the buck, it was a little forkhorn, took it back. And I noticed, because I had harvested deer down in Montgomery County where I grew up, which were much larger. And I asked the guys to camp, I said, he seems pretty small. And they said, it's these mountain bucks. They're different genetically. Not until I went to school to be a wildlife biologist that I learned, no, that poor deer is starving to death. That's why he was so small and his antlers were so pitiful, because there's just not enough food.
He was just eating ferns all day long. Yeah.
Yep. And in fact, a mistake was made down over the hill. They did a big clear cut in the mid 80s and they didn't put deer fence around it. And now the only tree species alive in there is a birch. It's the only thing a deer wouldn't eat. Wow. So if you think about the impact that deer population had on that forest, there's no oak trees there anymore. There's no mast. And a birch doesn't provide much for anything except shade.
Yeah.
What will you attribute, Brian, what we're saying about bigger bucks getting killed, but also, dang near the same number of people hunting as were in the 80s? What do you attribute that to?
Well, there's less people hunting now than in the 80s, but
but not by much, right? Is that what we said?
300,000.
Just a couple 100,000, not a huge amount.
But even in the 90s, it's probably a couple 100,000.
Okay.
Yeah, but look at, even in the 80s, we had deer, throughout most of the state. Why are there? So is your question why there are less, or why more larger deer?
Yeah. Why does it seem like we're killing more bigger bucks?
Oh, that's easy. We did, and with Gary Alt leading that charge, brought the deer numbers down to a point where the forest could sustain the numbers that are out there, which gave them, you had the genetics. Now with APRs, you gave them the age, and then with the deer numbers down a little bit, you could now get them where they could eat. So you got to have all three. If you don't have one of the three, you're not going to have a mature, nice quality animal. Doesn't mean you're going to have a 190, 200 class deer, but hey, a 140 is still pretty darn big in my book. And
absolutely,
you're not going to have that animal unless you give them the age, give them the food, and they've already got the genetics. So yeah, I got to get them two of those things.
Interesting. And and the crazy thing is it just took time. It took time for those things to kind of fall into place. I mean, growing up, I remember the first couple years of deer hunting been 94, 95, 96, something like 96, I think was my first year deer hunting. And I sat with my dad before that. I remember watching 30 does and fawns come through in a group, and there wasn't a buck in the whole group. And and guys got used to that. I mean, there were days that we came back, we hunted northern Clearfield County and stuff. There were guys that would come back from camp, and there wasn't a single guy sitting around the fire who didn't see at least 55 to 60 deer. And the unfortunate thing is that's how then expectations continued to go as we put in antler point restrictions and we increased the harvest with concurrent buck and doe seasons. And the reality was the forest couldn't sustain that stuff. Like the reason you weren't seeing any buck that was bigger than 100-inch 8-point was because number one, he got killed at 1. And number 2 was there wasn't food there for them.
Yeah. And the reality is in bad winters, you'd have a crash in the deer populations in those localized areas. Our agency staff, our game wardens in the spring used to walk the creeks up there and count the number of dead deer, and they'd break open the femur, and which would, if it's that reddish color, so they had no fat left. So they just basically starved to death. And what's the first age class of deer that goes first? Yep. Your fawns. So you're losing all that young population. So, I saw a letter the other day. And in the letter it said, our deer are gonna starve to death this winter. We need to back off in the antlerless harvest. No, if your deer are starving to death, it's because there's too many deer on the landscape.
Exactly.
A deer shouldn't have to starve to death out there in the wintertime. And in fact, after 2000, the number of deer that die from winter mortality is almost negligible. It's not really an issue in Pennsylvania. Deer are tough. They can hunker down. Sure. They can stay in one spot for a long period of time. And in the slow, you look at the wintertime for a whitetail deer, it's kind of like a slow diet for them. They burn off a lot of that fat that they've put on so they can come out that spring in decent condition.
Yeah. And I mean, even when I was managing private lands across the country, I would always tell people, like, guys, when I recommend a harvest, it's because I want that herd to be at the level that basically the worst conditions on the landscape, meaning that February, March, right before green up time frame could sustain. because if the population was higher than that at that time, they're just going to wipe out the entire habitat. And now you're going to suffer into the spring and you're going to suffer into the summer because they've essentially just wiped everything out. And so you manage that herd population to get to that level in check with whatever the lowest value is that resource could support in terms of the habitat. And it's different now when we've got supplemental food sources like food plots and if they're standing crops and stuff. But when you're talking about, pure timber areas, especially, I mean, walk through it right now. There's not much there. There's woody browse, and that's about what they're surviving on. So, Bryan, one last thing before we kind of let you go, just in a portal I like to dive down. We kind of talked about this with Matt, and so don't feel pressured if we still can't. But very curious around obviously Sunday hunting, but even so, can you guys look at and see if the addition of those Sundays has, I don't want to say led to like a substantial increase, but I mean, are we harvesting more animals because of those opportunities, or did we simply just kind of spread the time investment out?
As far as I can tell, looking at the data so far, it just spreads it out when they're harvested. Because we, for example, in their antlerless harvest, the number of antlerless deer taken in a wildlife management unit is determined by the number of antlerless tags available, not the length of the season. You can increase the season all day long. You just adjust the antlerless tags to meet that goal. So when it comes to white-tailed deer, the addition of Sunday is not going to be an impact because all I got to do is adjust the and we're not seeing a huge, you got to remember with Sunday, and we knew this going into it because I'd seen it in other states. Hunting on Sunday is not like hunting on a Saturday. Your hunting pressure is not near as high on a Sunday as it is on a Saturday. But the key is the folks like myself who have to work Monday through Friday, that Sunday's a real valuable day to me.
Absolutely.
It's one of the few times I can get out. But for a lot of people, they're not worried about it. They may have more time off, or they're just not worried about it, or they may have other reasons they don't hunt on Sunday. That's an individual decision they got to make. But no, we're not seeing an increase that we're seeing so far in harvest because of Sunday. Because again, Sunday's pretty much a light day, but at least they have an opportunity to go out there and enjoy it.
So we still got to push the state legislator to open them all up, right?
Well, I look forward to that day after living in states, where it's kind of weird to go to a state where you can't hunt on Sunday. To me, it's just kind of oddball, but, and I get it. It's tradition, and Pennsylvania is a very traditional state. It doesn't like change, but eventually we will have Sunday hunting. I mean, we've seen that the Sunday hunting over the last couple of years has not created any issues. We're not seeing this big, we had more citations because of trespassing to change the law with purple paint and things like that. But that's because of that change in that law and that we would react to it. But it's not. I think we had 140 citations issued last year. Pennsylvania is a big state with a lot of hunters. So we're not seeing huge trespass issues and, all the other claims you hear in every state, because I've lived in North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, and North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, where I was there when those states were getting into the Sunday hunting realm. And you heard all the reasons why you couldn't do it, because basically all the horses were going to get shot and all the cows were going to get shot and people were going to get shot and their pets were going to get shot and you couldn't go outside. And it always ended up the same at the end of the day. It's just no big deal. No matter how people want to make it a big deal, it's not. It's non-eventful, but it's a big deal to a lot of us hunters who really need that Sunday to be able to pursue what we love so much. Yeah, and it's such a weird topic because, you think that every hunter would be like, yeah, like I'm in support of it, but there's a lot that aren't, that are like, no, that's the day of rest, or that's the time to give the wildlife a break and stuff. And it's just, and like you said, it comes down to individual. It's like, listen, man, if you don't want to hunt, that's fine, but don't restrict me when I can't hunt during the week. Yeah. That is that's a huge value. Yeah,
give them Monday.
That's fine. Take Monday, run with it. Yeah, don't take Sunday from me. So, but I think the data side, because that's Jared and I have been really trying to dive into the numbers from all the different states that we hunt, but especially here in our home, is that you open a day like that, and me in the back of my head, there is concern of like, all right, well, how many more deer just got shot because there's another day available, especially during the gun seasons and stuff, but. Selfishly, my oldest killed his first buck at 7:36 on the first Sunday open during Pennsylvania gun season in 2020. And it was like, well, and the funny thing was, Bryan, is like, I'm sitting there, of course, I'm like emotional about it because like he just killed his first buck, but I'm also like, man, like you don't realize, like growing up, I could never hunt this day, like ever. And I said, obviously you probably weren't, but like you may have been the first person in Pennsylvania to shoot a buck legally on a Sunday. And how many years during gun season, and he was 8 at the time, so it didn't impact him like it impacted me, but I was just like, that is the availability of Sunday. Like, that is why it's there.
Yep. I love it. I've always had my son, when I lived in South Carolina, we had Sunday hunting on private lands. And, I worked for a national nonprofit called the National Wild Turkey Federation. So we worked pretty much Monday through Saturday, especially during that springtime. It was a busy time of the year. You had banquets going on, a lot of volunteer activities, and as staff, you work when the volunteers are working. If it wasn't for Sunday in South Carolina, I wouldn't have been able to hardly introduce my son to hunting in that state, just because that's the only time I had available to me.
Yeah.
But glad we had the opportunity.
No, for sure. Well, now that makes sense for your turkey addiction that you're part of NWTF.
I'm actually did my master's on turkeys too. So that's why I'm so
there you go. Did Matt let you go to the convention, or did he just go down there by himself?
Oh no, they had the marketing crew down there. I was out there. There's a lot of other agency directors and meetings that we have up there with Leadership and Forest Service, NRCS. So there's a lot of business that goes on at that meeting as well.
I heard it was a great show. The attendance sounded really good. Awesome, man.
At some point, we're going to dig in, and maybe it's when if Bryan wants to come on again. I need to understand like this obsession with turkey hunting.
We need him and Matt.
I just don't get it.
Just stay away. Just say no. Don't do it. Because number one, there's too many turkey hunters.
I have done. Don't get me wrong. I grew up turkey hunting. I've done it. I've killed a lot of turkeys.
But some people get into it and get hooked to it. I don't know why.
Oh, dude, I know some people that are as crazy about turkey hunting as I am about deer hunting, and that's really saying something. And I want to understand
crazy about turkeys as you are about deer. Yeah, deer for me are just good to eat. Turkeys, man, I build my own calls. I practice every day.
Well, and see, I think it comes down to like, because you get so invested in them, like you kind of can only pick one. You can hunt all of them, but you're going to pick one that you're like, my world revolves around.
Well, and I'll give you credit for at least it's not both equally, because I don't believe I don't believe those people.
Yeah,
I think in some way it becomes part of our identity. You know, if you think about it, it really becomes what we think about all the time. It's kind of how we kind of identify ourselves. It's kind of like, you ever meet somebody who hates flying in little airplanes, and then you meet a pilot who you wish you could do it every minute of the day. Some people take the thing, some people don't. No different than turkey or deer. I've always been, I like turkey hunting because I like to get out there and I like to hike a lot of miles. I like to cover a lot of ground, and they make noise. A deer, heck, I could swear to God, there's no deer within 200 miles of me. But if a bird gobbles, I know, by gosh, he's there. And if I just stick it out, I can do it. So if deer gobbled, I would never hear a single complaint about there's no deer.
Yeah, no doubt.
The deer are there. They just don't gobble.
That's it, man. Well, if you, we've got places here in the western part of Pennsylvania, but if you ever want to come turkey in Ohio, Jared and I both got 2 spots that, frankly, kill them all.
Kill them all. Yeah, you can have
man, my arm could be easily twisted for that.
Kill them all.
That's awesome, man. Well, listen, Bryan, we appreciate your time very much. And
thank you for having me on. It's been fun.
Well, thanks for just being transparent with us, man. And it's not saying that other people haven't, but as guys that are just so passionate about this resource, especially, and we just want to know the information. We can interpret it ourselves, but it's just having people be transparent. And like I said, I brought it up as a criticism, but it's only because I know that you've got some great biologists in the Game Commission that I think if people heard from them more, they would say, you know what? Those guys actually know what the hell they're talking about.
That's fair.
So you have to tell Matt that.
I will.
Well, we appreciate everything, man. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll definitely make sure we get you back on here in the future. And thank you for working so hard to keep this resource in the state so great.
Hey, man, God, it's an honor to be here. I'm humbled by the staff I get to serve. And remember, it's only about 62 days till turkey season.
There you go. All right. We appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Bryan.
I'd see you.
Well, great conversation there with Bryan. I think it's really cool. I mean, there's definitely some things that, like I said at the beginning of that, I feel pretty in tune with agency formats, and especially as he laid out that whole independent versus super agency side. That's stuff that I didn't, I looked at it always as a disadvantage, frankly. I figured you got too many administrators, you've got multiple people doing the same job, just in different groups. Like, why wouldn't you streamline that and have more money to the conservation? But apparently I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So interesting take on that
ways
side.
to skin a cat. I mean, I'm not obviously as knowledgeable on these like agency structures and stuff, but like I don't want a trout guy touching my deer policies either.
Well, and yeah, that's a good point. But I do think maybe it's not the Fish and Boat and the Game Commission as much as the DCNR, and I think they have biologists too, but the DCNR and the forest land is an interesting one because yes, those are in place for commercial forest operations and income, but you heard Bryan, he's got, what do you say, 1.4 million or something of game lands. That means the other 5 million-ish acres are in state forest, which is managed by the DCNR from a public land side. And those, though, offer good opportunities. In fact, that deer was bedded on DCNR property. They don't necessarily manage for better wildlife habitat. They manage for better timber.
Right.
And those definitely don't jive most of the time. Yeah. So that's maybe as we hear more of these people complaining, including myself who hunts Forbes State Forest, about like, I wish they would do a cut here. I wish they'd thicken this up. Wish they'd do that. Well, they won't because that's for timber practices, not wildlife practices. And that's 4 times the size of what the state game lands acreage is in the state. Mm-hmm. That's a big thing. And Bryan may take most of the blame, but he can't do anything about it. It's not under his jurisdiction, which is an interesting point.
Well, and I don't know how, or this comes into play, but like, I don't think we got to it until we had a separate conversation with Bryan there really briefly. And correct me here where I messed this up, but like there's actually and I'm sorry to always be on the crossbow thing. Mm-hmm. There's actually legislation that says
state statute
that crossbows are
archery
tackle. Therefore, the Game Commission has no grounds to separate the way that those seasons are approached. And so I'll just say that. But if anybody had beef to say, well, hey, that shouldn't be a part of this season, which some of us may have thought at some point.
Can't do it.
It's not the Game Commission's decision.
They're not. They legally cannot change it because it refers to that state statute, which crossbows are in there. Just like I think atlatls are in that same damn thing.
Who would have established that legislation?
It would have been proposed.
Voted on?
Yep, it would have been proposed by a representative in the legislature. So state legislature representative for one of the counties, who then brought it to the state representative floor, of which it passed the Senate, signed in by the governor.
The same way Joe Biden got into office.
No signatures. No signatures are involved in that.
Okay. So, but pretty much the same thing.
Pretty much the same. But in that same breath, I know a lot of people will say, man, I wish they just opened Sunday hunting. Or some of these people may say, no, I don't want Sunday hunting. The fact is first of all, the Game Commission is in full support of Sunday hunting. They've said it numerous times. Again, based on state statute, they can't change it. The Game Commission can't just say, cool, every Sunday during deer season is open. Can't do it. State legislation has to make that approval into law. Because right now, it's not part of a law, which means it can't be incorporated. Now, anything outside of the law, which is where antlerless tag allocations are, those things can be changed by the Game Commission because that is not a state law controlled factor. That's by the Board of Commissioners, which is the people that essentially Bryan is working with at the level to approve bag limits. Here in April is the meeting here in Pennsylvania. But Bryan made a really good point about the independent side, and that these other states, Illinois being one of them, which frankly is a huge red flag for me because that's a very liberal state. And that Illinois is in a super agency format, meaning that the governor basically could say, well, none of the hunters want us to deal with CWD in here, so we're not going to deal with it. And that could be a huge detriment to the entire deer herd population in the state of Illinois because the governor doesn't want the constituents to deal with it. Meanwhile, in an independent format, which is what Bryan's dealing with, yes, there are certain things from a state agency level that they have to abide by with the legislature, crossbows and archery tackle, Sunday hunting. But from a management side, stuff like CWD and doe allocations and things like that, no control from the political aspect, all at the Board of Commissioner level. Now, given, yes, there are some political influences at the commissioner level, but those guys can make that internal discussion and decision. Those other states can't. All goes to the top to the state legislature.
Interesting.
And therein lies the fact that politics run everything.
Yeah. Well, I'm encouraged that Bryan was willing to get on with us and give us some transparency. I think we learned a lot. Maybe there were some unanswered questions, but I think we'll have him on again.
Well, he gave us some stats. He answered the questions as truthfully as he could. That's what we're asking for.
Yep.
And I think I leave that conversation feeling pretty good. No doubt that Pennsylvania is not a state trying to manage for big bucks. It's not. It is trying to manage for better deer.
Timber, opportunities, and that's it. Timber and opportunities.
And a healthy resource.
Healthy.
For wildlife. Mm-hmm. Sustainable, I would say. Sustainable resource.
There's a buzzword for you.
But no, I think it was a great conversation. And again, we kind of danced around it, and I don't know what the answer is. We are killing big bucks in this state now. It's happening. We're killing 200 inchers in the state. We're killing constant 170s in the state. Something has changed, to the credit maybe of us as Pennsylvania hunters. It's our own mindset, not everybody's, but something had to have changed to get these deer to 4 to 5 years old. Or is it simply you removed 250,000 hunters, and just that change has had that much of a positive effect on the deer herd?
I'm gonna kill one this year. I'm gonna make a point of it.
Go Pennsylvania deer. Mm-hmm. With your car?
Hopefully not. With my bow, hopefully. My archery tackle.
Mm-hmm. The big questions we have to ask Bryan next time are, number one, are there mountain lions in Pennsylvania? We didn't cover that.
Okay.
Do they know, because he's a turkey guy.
I've got pictures of one.
Do you drop rattlesnakes out of helicopters to kill turkeys?
That one's obvious.
Yeah. Well, apparently he's a big turkey hunter, so apparently not. Do the car insurance companies pay you guys a substantial amount of money every year to decrease the deer population? So those are usually the big three that we didn't really put Bryan on the spot for.
Mm-hmm.
But it was good. Bryan was a good guy. We appreciate him coming on, and appreciate you listening to episode 63 of the HUNTR Podcast with Executive Director of Pennsylvania Game Commission, Bryan Burhans. And we will make sure we have him and Matt back. Although they want to talk turkeys with us, and
I glaze over.
Maybe we'll just turn the podcast on and walk away.
Yeah, you guys go for it. Have fun.
Have at it.
Have fun.
Yeah, have at it. Maybe we should call it turkey with just a Y.
Shit you did there.
You like that? Mm-hmm. All right. We appreciate everyone listening, and we will catch you next time.
Later.
Take me